Hi everyone, I'm number one Marmaduke fan, and this is an open letter to Gerry Conway. I despise Twitter drama. Apart from using the website to talk with friends and have a laugh, I think it's really sad that we've reached the point where Twitter conversations represent so much of our political discourse. And what I really hope is that in real life, people don't behave the way they do on Twitter. This is about an interaction I had with someone on Twitter, someone I admire. But I think it has broader implications, which is why I feel like I need to make a video talking about what happened to me today and why I'm thinking about it. In my very first take, which got deleted sadly, or maybe luckily, you could hear I was very emotionally affected. I think you could have heard it in my voice that I was upset about this, but I wasn't angry. And I'm kind of glad I lost that first take because this has given me a chance to put my thoughts together. I'm sad and I'm disappointed because today, someone who I admired, someone who made a story which impacted me as a young man in a positive way, intentionally insinuated that I was racist in such a way that he didn't directly say I was a racist by name. In my mind, there isn't much of a moral distinction between these two things. Mr. Conway, if you take the time to listen to this, I'm not mad at you. I'm not going to threaten to boycott you or never buy a comic book by you again. I mean, come on. What would it be? Maybe a fraction of a penny, if it would affect you at all? And to be honest, if you came into my house and you pointed in my face and you said, number one Marmaduke fan, but you didn't use my screen name, you used my real name, and you said, number one Marmaduke fan, you are a racist alt-right Nazi. The thing is, even if you had the courage to say that to my face directly and without any hidden meaning to what you were saying or trying to disguise it in any way, I would still admire your work. You would still not be able to undo the impact that the death of Gwen Stacy and the Spider-Man comics you wrote had on me as a young man growing up. Apart from the death of my beloved dog, when I was a young man, the only real experience I had with death was in fictional characters in stories I read. And if you would ask me, what is the first character that comes to mind when you think of the death of a fictional character that impacted you and taught you something important about death you took in adulthood? Instantly the answer is Gwen Stacy. I learned something from that book. I saw a character I loved and identified with, Peter Parker. I saw him fall in love with a woman, and this woman wasn't just an object of his desire. She was a character. She had a personality. She was a good person. So that when Gwen Stacy died, I didn't just care about it because I cared about Peter Parker. I cared about Gwen Stacy. I identified with Peter Parker because I cared about the character of Gwen Stacy, and she was gone. And you didn't just magically bring her back the next day or say it was all just a dream. Her death was permanent. It meant something. And I think the importance of a story like that is it teaches young people how to cope with death. We see Peter Parker emotionally distraught by losing the woman he loves. We see him want to murder the Green Goblin as revenge. And even though it's a fantasy story with characters in brightly colored costumed outfits, it teaches an important message about not letting your hate and anger consume you and turn you into a wicked person, that death is inevitable and we have to cope with it. You're someone who is my father's age, and I won't say that you were a father figure in my life because I've never met you, but at the very least, you wrote a story which connected with a lesson that both of my parents wanted to teach me when I was young. You did something positive in my life with your story. So I won't boycott your story. It means too much to me. But today what I'm thinking about, and the reason I'm disappointed, is I'm thinking about the words we say to one another and what these words mean and the effect it has on each other in the long term. What you said to me today reflects on you. And no matter how sympathetic or how forgiving I am, you are an adult and you are responsible for what you wrote. I'm sympathetic because there have been times where in my younger life where I would say mean things on the internet because I didn't care about the people I was talking with. And I'd look back on it and I'd feel regret. I'd feel like I had missed something important, that I insulted people I knew without just cause. And this caused me to really reflect on what I was doing with my life on social media. What kind of person did I want to be? And I took a long break from social media and I needed that. I came back more in control of my emotions, less less willing to let my emotions override my thinking and and just yell a bunch of names at a bunch of people. So today I had an interaction with you. This wasn't the first interaction you had with Twitter fans today. Today is May 6th. So I guess we need a little of the context, but I don't care too much about all the Twitter drama. This morning, Gerry Conway had some back and forth with people I know on Twitter who are interested in comics about politics. And effectively, Mr. Conway was upset about the Mercer family and thought they represented a right-wing agenda. And more than one comics fan thought that he should focus more on talking about comics and talk less about politics. And the reason I agree with this is that Gerry Conway is not a political scientist. I don't care what Ben Shapiro and Cenk Uygur think about comic books, but I'm interested in what they have to say about politics because both of them are prominent political voices, one on the right, one on the left. I am interested in what Gerry Conway has to say about comic books because he devoted his life and his professional career to writing some of the most iconic comic book stories ever written. And he co-created the Punisher, not my favorite character as a child, but definitely an influential character in the history of comics. Gerry Conway is not a professor of political science. I'm not particularly interested to hear his thoughts on the Mercer family and how he thinks that their donations are problematic or destructive. But I didn't really get into that whole spat. I just sort of watched from the sidelines. I think I may have made the comment effectively made the comment that Mr. Conway, you should consider not talking about these things online when you're primarily known for being a comic fan. But I didn't get yelly or insult you or call you a libtard or an SJW or anything like that. After a little while, a popular YouTube channel, Captain Cummings, made a video about this topic and Gerry Conway's response to his fans, saying that he doesn't want any of their money if they are such and such. I guess if they're alt-right or if they're right of center or if they're conservative, I don't know. But that's not my focus today. Shortly after that, and probably because of that Twitter back and forth, Gerry Conway wrote a second tweet. And he writes, "So, general question. Why does the alt-right imagine it's an insult to call someone a social justice warrior? Isn't justice a good thing? Don't we all live in a society? Isn't this another way of saying you're fighting the good fight? I accept it as an honorific." Now, apart from kind of generically saying to you, I don't know if you should be talking about politics, Mr. Conway, in one tweet that you may or may not even have seen, this is my first time interacting with you directly. And when I looked at this tweet and saw some of the salty comments you were getting, I paused because I didn't want to get salty and yell at you and say something unproductive. I wanted to say something to you that was productive and maybe make you think and prompt a good conversation with you. I went into this with the sincere hope that if we talked at all, if you bothered to talk to me, that you and I could have a good conversation. But I wasn't naive. What I sensed in this question is it's essentially a trick question. You were saying, why does the alt-right imagine it's an insult to call someone a social justice warrior? The trick to this question is that not everyone who thinks social justice warrior is an insult is alt-right. You can be on the left. You can be an advocate of social justice and say that social justice warriorism is a legitimate problem and it's a legitimate term. It's slang, but it describes a real group of people where different religious people, different races, different genders, different ethnicities, and different political persuasions, including on the left, can recognize that social justice warriors is a problem because they're too extreme. They're vile and destructive in their politics. So what do I write to you? I write, Gerry, why not read Thomas Powell's, and I meant to write Thomas Sowell, but had a typo. Thomas Sowell's The Vision of the Anointed. Plenty of people, including prominent people on the left, understand it is slang for a group of people it is perfectly legitimate to talk about. Are you looking to have a conversation or just stir the pot? And then in my second tweet, I corrected that as Thomas Sowell. So why did I bring up Thomas Sowell? Did I just want to name drop him because he's on a lot of sick YouTube videos where Thomas Sowell totally destroys so-and-so and he totally wrecks so-and-so? Well, the reason I mentioned a specific book. I didn't just refer you to an interview by Thomas Sowell. I didn't refer you to some newspaper column by Thomas Sowell. I referred you to The Vision of the Anointed. And based on your response to me that came later, I sincerely doubt you've read this book or you would have been able to correctly characterize what this book is about. It's not a right-wing book. Thomas Sowell is labeled as a conservative economist, but the whole point of the vision of the anointed is that it's talking about people who believe they are the anointed by God, and they have this vision for a utopia that they want to bring about. And because of this vision, they are blind to facts which contravene their narrative. If you believe you're going to bring about heaven on earth, and you believe this with all your might, facts refuting that belief aren't going to get through to you because the vision comes before the facts. And the thing about this is a very universal point. It's not a right-wing point. I, as a conservative, can hear this and say, okay, so what I should do is I should be careful not to become someone who thinks that I'm going to bring about heaven on earth, that I am the anointed by God, and that if everyone could just accept my vision for the world, then everything would be perfect and wonderful. It's a universal point that left or right could appreciate. This isn't just Thomas Sowell yelling libtard, libtard, libtard at a bunch of people. And the reason I bring it up is the vision of the anointed does not use the term social justice warrior, but it describes the mindset people are worried about when they use the slang term social justice warrior. You retweeted me, and you didn't retweet my first tweet. You retweeted the word Thomas Sowell when I corrected what I wrote. And you write, Thomas Sowell, yep, I remember him from the 1980s. He's the black conservative racist trot out to prove they aren't racists. I replied, but you did read him, Mr. Conway. If your intention is to imply I'm racist, then you just confirmed that you're stirring the pot. If you bothered to ask me what I think about white identity politics, I'd have told you I think it's satanic and a sin against God. I hate racism, Mr. Conway. So, what have you said to me when I wrote that tweet to you? You have said that you remember Thomas Sowell, he's a black conservative that racists trot out to prove they aren't racist. Well, what's that mean? Who's trotted out Thomas Sowell to prove? Oh, you've retweeted me. That's my name there. So, the thing is, you're an intelligent man. If you've had children or if you've had teenagers, you've probably had the experience of your teenagers trying to insult you or say, Daddy, you're not the boss of me. You're a big old stupid meanie pants. But they're smart enough not to say it that way. They might couch it in their tone of voice, or they might word it in such a way that it sounds like they're saying something innocuous, but you knew that they were saying you were stupid. And I bet you didn't like that as a father. I bet you wanted to teach your children that they ought to be respectful to you as their father and say what they mean and mean what they say. What have you said to me? Well, you've said that racists are people who trot out the black conservatives like Thomas Sowell. I didn't bring up Thomas Sowell's race. Why did you bring up Thomas Sowell's race, sir? Thomas Sowell's race has absolutely nothing to do with the vision of the anointed, the specific book I brought up, because I thought it was relevant to the question you were asking about. When I suggest you read a book by Thomas Sowell, and then you retweet me, and you say, Thomas Sowell is someone racists trot out to prove they aren't racists, what everyone knows you are saying is you are insinuating that I am a racist for trotting out Thomas Sowell. I didn't trot out Thomas Sowell because he's black. I don't care about his skin color. His skin color is irrelevant to the point I was trying to make, that there are books on the topic of the vision of the anointed that are relevant to social justice warriorism, the question you're asking about. So you can deny it. You can say, oh, number one Marmaduke fan, I didn't say you're a racist. But you, sir, know exactly what it is you're communicating in this tweet to you in public to your thousands of fans. Now, as I look at this, you've got about 8 likes out of your several thousand fans. 8 people like it when you insinuate that I am a racist for mentioning the name of a book by Thomas Sowell. I hope those people enjoy your comics. I hope they buy your comics and The Death of Gwen Stacy, and they read that and they gain something from that. But I have a sneaking suspicion that the 8 people who like seeing you do this to me are not big comic book fans. Some of them may be. They may read lots of comic books. They may like your comic books. But I don't think that they can be consistent with the worldview of social justice while reading and enjoying your comic books, because I am someone who was educated in what the view of social justice theory is as applied to the arts. So here's the question I have from you. Since the tweet that started this was you saying social justice warrior shouldn't be an insult and proudly identifying yourself as a social justice warrior, how much time have you taken to read what intersectional feminist theory is and the relevance of critical race theory to intersectional feminist theory, or the deconstruction of patriarchy and of Western philosophy and of colonialism to the intersectional theory? Because in my mind, when someone says social justice warrior or social justice, that is an incredibly related concept to the intersectional lens. I feel like they're as related as maybe believing that Jesus is the Son of God is to being a Christian. If you don't believe that Jesus is the Son of God, you're not really a Christian. It's as related as the theory of natural selection is to being a biological evolutionist. If you say you're a biological evolutionist and you deny that Darwin was right about the theory of natural selection, or at least the basics of the theory, you can't really be one without being the other. You can't really be a social justice warrior without, or a advocate of social justice without talking about the intersectional feminist lens. And you can't talk about the intersectional feminist lens without talking about social justice. So since you've identified yourself as a social justice warrior, what I would hope is that you're at least passingly familiar with what I'm talking about when I talk about the intersectional lens. In fact, I don't have to imagine that you are. I've seen conversations where I know you know what I'm talking about. When I was a student in art school, I had students in my class who would complain about sexism and racism and homophobia and transphobia in comic books. And they didn't just have a problem with contemporary comic books, no. They had a problem with comic books going all the way back to the beginning, including the years that where you spent your life as a comic book professional, all of your friends in the comic book industry. That was what they had a problem with because they were using the intersectional feminist lens to critique comic books and identify sexist, misogynist, patriarchal themes in these kinds of stories. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to imagine a college class being taught that's called The History of Comic Books through the lens of intersectional feminist theory. And as they teach about the history of comic books, they don't just teach about who wrote what and who drew what and what Marvel was and what DC was. They're encouraging their students to think about comic books through this lens in order to identify what is bad for social justice, what is problematic, and to identify what good art is. And in my experience as an art student, the people who use this lens equated politics with art. Your art wasn't good art unless it promoted a progressive politics. And progressive politics was the total reason for the value of any art that you made. It wasn't beauty, because beauty comes from Western patriarchal assumptions about objective beauty. It wasn't something like hard work and how much effort you put into your stories or your art, because hard work kind of comes from a Western capitalist assumption about the value of labor. The valuable art would be political art, as summarized by the phrase, the personal is political. And this would lead people to make very bizarre art projects that were in theory about some sort of progressive political theme, but it wouldn't be really that obvious. There'd be, feathers stuck to the wall and blood dripping down from them, and this was supposed to be something about rape culture, and you wouldn't really get what the heck the feathers had to do with rape policy, but that was the point. Politics was art, art was politics. In this class where they're teaching about the history of comic books, they want to talk about a very problematic element in the history of comic books, and that's the objectification of women in popular superhero comic book stories. And they want to talk about a famous blog that called attention to this, and that was Women in Refrigerators. And the thing about Women in Refrigerators is, before I was even into superhero comic books again, I took a break from them. I read superhero comic books as a little kid, took a break when I was a student. But I didn't just have young students, young radical leftists saying, oh, hey, go read the Women in Refrigerators blog. I had professors referring me to the Women in Refrigerators blog. These were people who couldn't care less about superhero comics and superhero stories, but when they would find out I was interested in drawing comics, they would want me to read this in order to get a perspective on problematic sexism in the history of comics and what I could do to make more socially just comics. Okay, well, let's look at Women in Refrigerators. Oh, so it's by Gail Simone, okay, and she's concerned about the deaths of women in comics and whether there's something disproportionate about this. She's got the image of Kyle Rayner discovering his dead girlfriend murdered by a villain in the refrigerator. And she has a list. She has a list of women who have been put in the refrigerator. And what do we see on this list? Well, we see Gwen Stacy. Well, that's interesting. I wonder if she had you in mind while making this list. And sure enough, we see Gerry Conway's response on this blog. So, boy, here I am, an art student. My professors, not the radical Marxist students, but the professors have encouraged me to read this blog and learn a little bit about sexism in comics. And here's Gerry Conway responding to the accusation that the death of Gwen Stacy is an instance of the sexist women in refrigerators trope. I haven't read the comments of your other respondents, so mine is a fresh, uncontaminated response. As a writer who's killed Gwen Stacy, raped Cinder of Cinder and Ash, and maimed, well, no, I don't think I ever maimed anyone. But if I did, it was probably during a blackout in the late 70s. So you're kind of being a little coy and cutesy in writing to Gail. All I would say is you didn't kill Gwen Stacy. You didn't rape Cinder. You wrote fictional stories where this happened. You continue, I hardly plead innocence when it comes to violence against fictional females. In fact, I think you're onto something. There does appear to be a disproportionate high number of female superheroes who've met gruesome deaths. Of course, since comic book superheroes began life as an adolescent male fantasy figures, and for the most part continue to fill that role, we shouldn't be surprised the primarily male creators of comics act out subconscious adolescent male hostility toward women in their art. So you've coyly admitted to doing this to Gwen Stacy, but what you haven't said here is that mea culpa, I have written a sexist story. I am a sexist for writing this story. I have contributed to the oppression of women and the perpetuation of patriarchy by writing comic book stories, including one where Gwen Stacy dies. You kind of cutely just said, oops, I guess I've done this. But you're not talking about it as if you've done something serious. You're not talking about as if you've contributed to the objectification and the oppression of women. Powerful women, you write, equals mommy, equals enemy/love object/tormentor of the post-pubescent male psyche. Sadly Freudian, but true. Well, is that true of you? Did you kill Gwen Stacy because you have this sort of post-adolescent male hostility toward women and you wanted to express that toward Gwen Stacy in your story and in your art? I don't have that read on the death of Gwen Stacy. I see Gwen Stacy as a character who I care about, who's a woman, who is a good woman. She's a smart woman. She's not some little toy that Peter Parker plays with. And her death affects me as much as it does Peter Parker. I don't see anything sexist in that because writers need to have death in their stories. And death needs to affect women and it needs to affect men. Otherwise, are we actually sexist if we say that women are so delicate and fragile that we can't have stories in which women die and there's real death and it has real impact? Is it okay to kill off men because men are tough and can deal with it, but it's not okay to kill off women because if we do that, we're somehow objectifying women and upholding the patriarchy? I think that's silly. I think that the story of Gwen Stacy's death and its impact on Peter is not an instance of you internalizing sexism or internalizing a Freudian post-adolescent hatred of women. I think it's you writing a story that you thought had impact and had meaning at the time you wrote it. Even so, the intensity of violence against comic book superheroines, in fact against everyone, male, female, super or otherwise, seems to have increased exponentially since I quit writing comics in the late 80s. I was appalled by the comic page reproduced on your website, but I suppose it's representative of what's happened to the medium. It confirms a belief I developed in the 80s, that more and more mainstream comics are being designed to appeal primarily to the kids in River's Edge. If you don't know the movie, find it, rent it, and tell me I'm wrong. In this context, violence against superheroes is part of a continuum, a cyclical, spiritless dehumanization of the superhero art form. As a friend of mine remarked recently in another context, welcome to the post-ironic world. Well, you're sort of separating yourself from the world of comics after the 1980s, aren't you? You're saying whatever admission you may have to guilt, you're saying it's worse now. They're more sexist and they're worse to women than I was back in my day. And what I would ask you is, how do you want to be remembered? You may not care if I buy your comic or don't buy your comic, a few pennies, whatever. Do you care about how people teach your role in the comic book industry in the future? If you have grandchildren maybe, and they go to a class on the history of comics, do you care if the professor shows a picture of Gwen Stacy, talks about the sexist women in refrigerators trope, and says that you, Gerry Conway, wrote the most famous example in the history of comics of a sexist instance of a woman dying to motivate the male power fantasy, that Gerry Conway contributed to the perpetuation of patriarchy and the objectification of women. Now, maybe you hear that and you just laugh and you think, that's ridiculous. Even if they said that, why would I care? It's so ridiculous. Of course I'm not hurting anybody. I didn't do anything wrong by writing a story where Gwen Stacy died and this motivates Spider-Man to seek revenge against the Green Goblin. Well, all I can say is the world when you were a young man growing up and what the schools taught about art when you were growing up or writing is very different from what I learned as a student. Because what I learned as a student is that your entire industry is sexist, racist, homophobic, and transphobic, and Western chauvinistic. And it was that before the 80s. It was that for the entire time you were alive and working. And that you are the number one example of the sexist women in refrigerators trope. Yes, the Kyle Rayner and the woman stuffed in the refrigerator, that's the one that named the trope. But let's be honest, a lot more people read and were affected by the death of Gwen Stacy than care about Kyle Rayner. Kyle Rayner is nowhere close to Spider-Man in terms of being a widely read character. So in the future, when people using the social justice lens talk about sexist tropes in comic books and women being objectified and made objects as part of male power fantasies, the death of Gwen Stacy is always going to be the number one example in people's minds of a female character dying to make a sexist, toxically masculine tale. You created the Punisher. What is the Punisher if he is not the epitome of what social justice advocates mean when they talk about toxic masculinity in the medium? And if we're just talking about a few offensive things in comic books, whatever. But what I'm trying to communicate to you is that my teachers believed that you, as an individual, Gerry Conway, perpetuated sexism by your involvement in the comic book industry. You were complicit in the perpetuation of sexist, misogynistic patriarchy for writing stories like the death of Gwen Stacy. So since you have proudly identified yourself as a proud social justice warrior, I would really like to hear you clarify what, not just by sort of cutely joking about, oh yeah, I guess I killed off Gwen Stacy, I guess I had a fictional female character get raped in cinders and ash. I would like to hear you clarify if you are okay with people talking about the death of Gwen Stacy as a critical example of sexism in the comics medium. I want to know if you're okay with the picture of Gwen Stacy being dead, being up there on the slide, and a comics professor teaching the students, Gerry Conway wrote the most famous instance of this sexist trope in the history of comics. Are you okay with that? Is that what you want to be remembered for? Because if you sincerely believe that that's what you did back then, it might, and you want to be a good social justice warrior, it might be a good time to check your privilege as a white male, to acknowledge your privilege as a white male, and to comment on how you individually were culpable, how you individually wrote the story where Gwen Stacy died, and how you individually are responsible for the sexism and the misogyny that your story engendered in the minds of young comic book fans. Or maybe you think that's absurd. If you think what I'm describing is absurd, then congratulations. You disagree with the intersectional social justice theory being applied to your comic book to argue that your story is sexist and that you participated in sexist, misogynist, patriarchal culture in writing it. So I would applaud you, but then I guess the question is, are you really a social justice warrior if you don't think that the lens of social justice should be applied to you as an individual and the story that you told in The Amazing Spider-Man? Maybe you don't care that much about Gwen Stacy. Maybe you're more proud of other comic books you wrote during your life. But I really want to know if you're okay being remembered the way that people remember artists who drew racial caricatures. Because in the mind of my professors who taught me to use the intersectional lens, stories like the death of Gwen Stacy are roughly the moral equivalent of drawing a racist caricature of a black man with big lips. That's going to be your legacy in the world where social justice warriors teach art classes and teach their politics in the context of art classes. They think that you and your stories perpetuate patriarchy. They think patriarchy is sexist and misogynist against women. They think you individually contributed to that culture, and that your story of the death of Gwen Stacy is the illustration of that. So they're going to look at you the same way that you and I might look at Will Eisner's racist caricatures of characters in The Spirit, or racist caricatures of Japanese people in old Looney Tunes cartoon. Is that your legacy, Gerry Conway? Is that how you want your grandkids to remember you? Do you want them to hear your name, Gerry Conway, Grandpa Gerry Conway, the writer of one of the most famous sexist comics in the history? Well, here's the thing, Gerry Conway. In those classes, I was the person who would say, wait a second, you guys are missing something. And I'm going to use an example of a video game because this was the actual conversation I had, but I did have this conversation too about comic books, including the Women in Refrigerators blog, with my peers and with my professors. So about this video game, it's called Chrono Trigger. There's a moment where one of the girl characters disappears and the guy has to go and save her. And so people will say, well, see, this is sexist. The woman is being reduced to a damsel in distress. The man is going off to save her. This is a male power fantasy, reducing a woman to an object, and it's perpetuating misogyny. But then what I would say to these people is, you're missing the whole story of Chrono Trigger. There's actually a time where Chrono is in danger, and he's actually dead. And 3 women and a robot and a frog have to go on a journey to save the young male protagonist. So it's not that it's treating the woman like an object. It's that there are some characters who are in danger sometimes, and there are other characters who are in danger other times. Sometimes the boy's in danger, sometimes the girl's in danger, and they rely on each other. They're friends. They help one another. They overcome evil together. It's an inspiring story. And if you don't care about Chrono Trigger, if you don't beat the game Chrono Trigger, you might miss that context. You might just think that Chrono Trigger is only about a poor little damsel in distress that the boy goes and saves. But you only think that if you either don't play it or you play it and you ignore the context that you don't care about because you're more concerned about making a political point. So had this conversation about women in refrigerators too. They would say, oh, the women in refrigerators trope, it's sexist. And I would say, well, aren't women supposed to be able to die in stories just as well as men can? Are you saying that if I kill a female character in my story because I want her death to have impact, because I want death to have meaning in my stories, I want it to resonate with things in real life, am I a sexist if I do it to a woman but not a man? And I would be the one voice of opposition on this. These people didn't read. The vast majority of them didn't read or ever care about the death of Gwen Stacy. They didn't care to read the Spider-Man comics which preceded it. They were interested in making a political point about patriarchy to try to teach their students how to make heavily politically themed art. And Women in Refrigerators was just a convenient way of making the point of horrible, racist, sexist bigots in comics. And you are named here as an illustration of the sexist trope. And I'm not happy with that. I don't want that to be your legacy. I want my children to be able to read The Death of Gwen Stacy and to have a conversation, and I want to be able to have a conversation with them about death and not letting death destroy you, not let it turn you into an evil person. That's what I want my children to take away from your story and your legacy. But the social justice warriors you're aligning yourself with, they don't want that to be your legacy. They're not invested in your legacy. I'm sure you heard about this when The Amazing Spider-Man 2 came out, because this happened again. People were writing think pieces for feminist blogs about the problematic issue of Gwen Stacy dying and how it was sexist. Well, that movie was drawing plot elements from a story you scripted. Did you hear any of those? Did you have any thoughts on those? Do you agree that you were a sexist to write that story? Do you think that it just doesn't matter and it's a problem that, it's a few weirdo leftists on college campuses, whatever? Well, what I'm telling you is it's not a few weirdos. It's the teachers. And it's going to be the generation after generation after generation, student after student. Oh, you're interested in comic books? Well, check out the Women in Refrigerators blog. Oh, check out this sexist example of a writer killing a female character to motivate his male character. You've written this response to Gail Simone as if you acknowledge that you may have had some latent sexism when writing those stories. If that's true, I feel sorry for you. That's not what you wrote. The Death of Gwen Stacy, that story you scripted, that's a meaningful story. That's a story that takes seriously male and female characters. And I feel sorry for you if you've accepted the argument that you're a sexist for writing that. And if you are going to say you are a social justice warrior and call me a racist for asking you if you have read The Vision of the Anointed. I'd like to see you clarify if you were a sexist for writing the Gwen Stacy character, and if you're okay being remembered as the sexist author of that story forever. I would take no pleasure in that. I wouldn't say, ah, haha, you were mean to me and now you're getting yours. I would be sad because you still, no matter what you said to me, you still wrote a story that impacted me. I don't want that to be your legacy. I want you to be remembered as the person who wrote one of the most impactful stories in the history of one of the most popular superhero characters ever that had a positive impact on the young people who read it. I do not believe that you wrote that story because you have latent hatred for women that you were expressing in sort of a vitriolic way to get back at Gwen Stacy. I believe you were writing a story with purpose. But from now on, the legacy, what you have done today by calling me a racist, anytime I see your name on that comic page again, it's not like it's spoiled it. It's not like it's ruined it and I'll never read it again, boo-hoo-hoo. But I'm going to remember our conversation that we had today. I'm going to remember that when a person who wrote a story that I've admired and has stuck with me all my life interacted with me, that he immediately insinuated that I was a racist for bringing up Thomas Sowell, without so much as asking me one question about who I am, what I believe, and what I think about racism. Don't you dare deny that you were insinuating I was a racist in that tweet. You know what you did. And I would accept your apology because I'm a Christian, I believe in forgiveness. But and no matter how sympathetic I am to you, no matter how much I want you to see you have a good legacy where people remember you fondly and they don't remember you as an awful, horrible bigot who wrote the horrible, sexist Women in Refrigerators comic, you're still an adult. And I still hold you accountable for writing what you wrote after reading what I wrote. I'm #1 Marmaduke fan, and I forgive you, Mr. Conway. I love you guys, and I'll catch you later.